Good afternoon, folks. It's your boy Nicky Stees back with an impromptu live stream exclusively on my channel. Now, I'm not doing this under the Hardcore Sports Network banner or StreamYard. This is just an impromptu, let me just speak while it's on my mind, live stream for my channel. And this was inspired by the discussion I had earlier today on episode 18 of the 3-Point Blitz, where I was joined by Coach Ed Gladney. On that stream, before we got into the growth of women's sports, we started off talking about domestic violence, particularly in relation to last week. Lightweight boxer Gervonta Tank Davis was arrested on domestic battery, this being the third separate incident he's had such a situation. And me and Coach discussed mainly about domestic violence a little bit. And that while I was eating lunch, I started thinking more about it. I started thinking about how brain damage is often linked with professional athletes, particularly committing domestic violence. But then I thought about them, started thinking more about the subject itself while I was eating lunch, cleaning my room, and all of a sudden, I felt inspired to come on here and speak up and give you my thoughts on the subject, which was the group. What's the word? Which was the backstory behind the inspiration for this impromptu live stream. So we're going to talk about domestic violence and brain injuries right here and the correlation between the two. So I'm going to get started in like a minute or so. We'll actually dive into what I have to say. I want to share it out a little bit before we get started, and then we'll dive right into it. Now, I guess this is an impromptu stream, so I'm not expecting like the chat to be, just on fire at all times because, like I said, this is impromptu, but we'll give it a go and see what happens here. So talk about it while it's still fresh on my mind. And so let's get right to it. So we're going to start off. Now, we know that brain injuries are linked to domestic violence, particularly amongst professional athletes. We've often heard that thrown around. Lawyers have made that claim. You've had that, as well. You've had family members, fans. A lot of people like to push that out there, particularly when it comes to domestic violence amongst professional athletes. So we get it. And to some degree, it can have a correlation, particularly for people that participate in the physical sports, such as mixed martial arts, football, hockey, boxing, how even pro wrestling, even though it's predetermined, it's scripted, it's a mix of athletics and theater, there are the risks of injury and brain damage can come from it. So I get it. Yes, brain damage can play a role. It can certainly mess up your mind, your ability to think, can lead to more incoherent outbursts, and that could put you at risk of committing assault. But with that being said, that's not always going to be the case. We'll dive right into it. Take a look at some cases, notorious cases where brain damage was linked to the incidents. We'll start some of the most notable incidents. You had back in June 2007, for anybody that was a WWE fan that's in here, you guys remember this, the infamous Chris Benoit double murder suicide. Afterward, it was linked that brain damage played a role in it. And there was a whole lot of diaries from Benoit that were real, those last year of his life, some real strange journal entries, which hinted at the idea that his mental state was deteriorating before the double murder suicide. And I do feel like that did play a role in it. So that's an example where you could say that brain damage may have played a role. Another notorious one, you had Carlos Monzon, who was a middleweight boxer during the golden years. He spent the later portion of his life in prison for a domestic dispute, which involved the death of his either wife or girlfriend at the time. And brain damage was mentioned by lawyers. It was believed to be one of the leading causes of the incident itself. And you've seen a few examples there when it comes to domestic violence. You've also had, but you've also had some other cases where you've had notorious cases of domestic violence, like you had recently Gervonta Tank Davis. Now, he's not one of the main people that comes to mind when it comes to brain damage boxers. Matter of fact, he's still young, still at his peak. One of the more notorious cases, though, on the flip side, is Muhammad Ali. Him having Parkinson's disease in the later stages of his life, and dementia playing a role in his post-boxing years. But from what we've heard of Muhammad Ali, there was never any incidents of spouse abuse going on with his life. So even though he's one of the poster boys for brain damage related to boxing, we didn't hear any stories of him beating his women like we did, like currently Tank Davis or Floyd Money Mayweather at his peak. Both those guys I just mentioned having numerous run-ins with the law in relation to domestic violence, battery, assault, whichever phrase you want to refer to it as. So there's one example right there. Now, going back to the first example, you talk about Chris Benoit for a minute. Yes, did he have brain damage? Yes, it was later revealed that he did. Did he have a bunch of concussions? Yes, he did. But then I could point to, as I put in the thumbnail, those you guys saw, you saw the picture of Mick Foley with the X no through it. Now I'm going to use that example as well. This is what contradicts the claim, the idea of Chris Benoit's brain damage playing a role. Even though it does to a certain degree, it's still not an excuse for what he did. Killing his wife and then his 7-year-old child. Brain damage alone does not make you do that. Now, could it play a factor? Yes, but if you have other character concerns such as lack of self-control or irrational mood swings prior to suffering significant brain damage, CTE, head trauma, that also makes you more likely to react that way. So you could also point to character concerns on top of brain damage as a reason certain individuals act a certain way. So now you look at a guy like Mick Foley, who anyone who followed his career knows he's had a long list of injuries, particularly head injuries. Now, does Mick Foley have brain damage? Absolutely. Does he, I'm sure, say and do dumb things as a result? Yes. Are there times he's probably forgetful? I'm sure there are. I'm sure so. But last time I checked, pretty much anyone who's ever spoke about Mick Foley has spoke positively about him. You haven't heard stories of him being aggressive toward women. You haven't heard stories of him being arrested on assault or battery. You haven't heard those stories. If you think about it, name me the last time you ever heard any of those stories about Mick Foley. Exactly. Matter of fact, now this is kind of going off subject from domestic violence, but Mick Foley being in an industry where you've had a lot of people have had stories of going out to clubs, trying to drug women, people taking liberties with their coworkers or flight attendants, all these different horror stories. Mick Foley was considered one of the safest places for a woman, period, whether it be a woman working at a bar, a woman in the wrestling industry, wherever, to be around. Mick Foley, out of all the pro wrestlers, is considered one of the safest spots for a woman to be by. And yet, despite brain damage, clearly he doesn't have issues with domestic violence. He doesn't have issues with assault and battery. So on the flip side, that debunks the idea of Benoit possibly doing it because of brain damage. Yes, it's possible brain damage did play a role in the events in the later stages of his life. But you could also look at that as, well, inability to control mood swings. You could look at that as lack of self-control. And some of those factors may play a role as well. But then you also look at another incident involving a guy, Bret Hart. He had one of the most famous concussions of all. Late 1999, he got a concussion that eventually followed by post-concussion trauma or whatever it is that forced him to retire from wrestling. But then a few years later, as a result of the concussions, he had a stroke. But through all that, you don't hear any stories of Bret Hart attempting murder on his spouse or beating or striking or stabbing or anything along those lines. So on the flip side, you do have a few examples of people who have certainly had their brain damage, but also have not committed such heinous acts. And you could just look throughout any different industry that involves any physical sports or part sport, part art form, whatever the case be, that could have put someone at risk of brain damage. And yes, while those industries do have people that fall on the spectrum of brain damage that have committed violent acts, in part because of it, it's not the sole factor. I could use a lot of different examples. Could look at football, guys with CTE. Now, you got guys, you know what? I used in the thumbnail, Steve Young with the X through it. And the reason why is because despite Steve Young, remember, was forced to retire due to brain injuries. He had got him and Troy Aikman were the main two for, okay, you can only, if you get more than like 5 concussions or so, you're out of the NFL. Steve Young had to retire in 99 due to repeated concussions, followed by Aikman the next year. But despite the fact that Steve Young clearly got his bell rung over and over and obviously has some form of brain damage, Steve Young doesn't have these stories of domestic violence. There's no criminal cases. There's no line of mugshots for separate assault, battery, or domestic violence incidents involving Steve Young. And the same goes with Troy Aikman, the guy who had to retire the following year for the same reason. So yes, do those guys have brain damage? Absolutely. But you don't hear stories of these guys getting arrested for domestic violence or spouse abuse. While I'm sure they have, there are certainly effects of brain damage, such as forgetfulness, struggling, incoherency with literature, struggling to pronounce sentences properly, constant stuttering, forgetfulness. I'm sure those are all factors to some degree. However, you don't see or read any stories of these guys involved with domestic violence despite having brain damage. And like I said, the Muhammad Ali example, we don't hear stories of spouse abuse. There are stories of womanizing. There were stories of him being an adulterer and being unfaithful. But there's no stories of spousal abuse. And then on the flip side, here's a perfect example. Josh Brown, the former kicker for the Seattle Seahawks, at the time St. Louis, now Los Angeles Rams, and former New York Giants kicker. Josh Brown had numerous run-ins with the domestic violence. Numerous. And keep in mind, he was a kicker. Out of all the positions in football, high school, college, professional, the two positions where players take the least physical abuse, the least likely to suffer brain damage, are kicker and punter. And Josh Brown was a kicker. You didn't see him getting whacked left and right because he was only a kicker. But guess what? Josh Brown still had numerous incidents with domestic violence, including one incident at a Super Bowl. Now, I don't know if this was Super Bowl 40 with the Seahawks when they played the Steelers or Super Bowl 46 with the Giants. I think, was Lawrence Tynes still the kicker Super Bowl 46? I know he was Super Bowl 42, but the point being is, at some point during the Super Bowl, I think Super Bowl 40, somewhere during that weekend where he was with his teammates, there was an incident where he was getting really pissed off and he had to be restrained by one of his teammates. Mind you, this is a kicker. So that eliminates the potential correlations between brain damage. And that tells you there's other issues related to Josh Brown that could cause him to act that way. And then in the case, but then some people will probably point to, say, a guy like Floyd Money Mayweather and say, well, he's a boxer. He gets punched in the face for a living. Yes, that's true. But there were other guys. Here's the thing with Mayweather. Mayweather was known. He didn't really take as many shots. He was known more as a defensive fighter compared to other boxers. But the point being is he was less likely compared to some of his counterparts in that sport to take as many shots and suffer as much brain damage. But he still is one of the most notorious woman abusers in the sport. Despite the fact that he, on average, I'm sure has less brain damage compared to his peers in the sport. But he still did so repeatedly. And as you notice throughout these examples, I've given examples of people who committed spouse abuse particularly athletes who I'm sure had their brain injuries for sure, but then you see others who either had their significant brain injuries that didn't commit spouse abuse, that don't have any arrests for domestic violence, versus those who probably didn't suffer as much brain trauma compared to some of their peers, especially you, Josh Brown, the kicker, but they still got involved in domestic disputes, which means there's a bigger cause than just brain injuries in relation to domestic violence. And when we're talking about domestic violence, we got to remember something. It doesn't just pertain to sports either. It pertains everywhere in life. It pertains in sports, in Hollywood, whether that be music, movies, TV, etc. And then you look at everyday life. You get people in all walks of life: hospitality, construction, manufacturing, whatever the case may be. Lifeguards, teachers, doctors, lawyers, police officers, all these different people in different occupations that have had histories and run-ins with domestic abuse. It goes to tell you that there's much bigger correlation to domestic abuse in our society than just brain damage, because when it comes to domestic abuse, the bus goes further than just sports. It's a huge societal issue that involves people in all walks of life. And most of these people I'm referring to, police officers, teachers, you could look at, firefighters, anybody in any industry. You could talk, like I said, manual labor, construction, etc. They get involved in domestic disputes, but they're less likely to have brain damage than athletes who participate in physical sports. So obviously there's a greater correlation here in our society when it comes to abuse. Now, when it comes to particularly Floyd Money Mayweather, I'm going to go back to that because this is an easy example. For him, his biggest issue is lack of respect for women. So if you want to talk about the issues, two of the main ones are lack of respect and lack of self-control. Now, when it comes to the lack of self-control, let's break it down. Now, first off, we understand that there are situations in life between men and women that get heated. Sometimes you get those people, both sides, both genders, in this case, women, who do have horrible attitudes, who like to run their mouth, who think that they can say and do whatever they want to. And sometimes they could bait people into snapping. So I understand that can play a role. But as Coach Ed said earlier on episode 18 of the 3-Point Blitz, you got to know when to walk away. And I'm going to reiterate that point because ultimately you do. You have to know when to walk away from these situations. Sure, sometimes you get those situations where people think they can just do or say whatever, talk to you any kind of way, but you still got to be able to control yourself. That does not, just because someone's got a big mouth and they talk disrespectfully, does not make it okay for you to snap on them. Does not make it okay to strangle them or throw them to the ground or kick them while they're down. And also, when it comes down to it, you got to be careful who you bring in your inner circle as well. And this is where I get into the advice side of it. For people, everyone watching this video, you got to particularly be careful when it comes to personality. You got to know the person who you're hanging out with, who's in your inner circle. You got to know their attitude. You got to know their personality. Know if they're prone to mouthing off, talking down people, disrespecting people, etc. You got to know that. And if there are situations where you're dealing with people who do such, you got to be able to know when to cut them off and say, hey, this person has a history of being disrespectful. You got to know to cut them off, man, so you don't find yourself in a troubling situation. And the same thing can be said for relationships. Before you really get into a serious relationship with somebody, make sure you know them first. Know the ins and outs. And if you see red flags in somebody, that's when you know it's time to walk away. Now, the same can be said for people who have history of abuse. Now, when it comes to one benefit, now in this case, switching sides, for women who could date professional athletes or celebrities is the one benefit is they know that person's history. You can easily research their history and learn a little more about them through research if you feel that person isn't opening up and giving you all the information you want. And if you see red flags on that person, like if you research someone famous and you see this person has a history of multiple assault allegations or battery allegations or both, that's a red flag to keep your distance from them. So there's also that, know the red flags, and then vice versa. Like I'll give a perfect example of Chad Johnson. Remember his marriage to Evelyn? Remember how he lost his spot on the Miami Dolphins over a headbutt and got arrested for it and eventually served some jail time for it. But remember Evelyn, there were red flags from her personality because wasn't she a reality TV star? And didn't she come across as an unlikable, snotty person on TV? Which on that front, Chad Johnson should have seen the writing on the wall and realized this may not be a good match. This person has a history of unethical behavior. While it is a TV show, I think personally, Chad Johnson, before he and Evelyn really got serious, should have talked to more people that knew her personally or tried to get more information to see, is this all an act for TV or are there actually signs that Evelyn really is this way? And that's one thing that could have prevented Chad Johnson from getting into that situation. So that's one example where someone ignoring red flags ended up being a mistake. They got stuck in a relationship with an unpleasant person who ended up causing them harm. So that's one example right there.